This debate celebrates the centennial of Stanisław Lem's birth that is observed and celebrated worldwide this year. Year 2021 is recognized as Stanisław Lem year, following a special commemorative act issued by the lower chamber of the Polish Parliament late last year. There is a very rich program, and we are very proud to be contributing our little brick, our little contribution to the worldwide celebrations of Stanisław Lem, where we feel the strongest. So in science fiction and future studies, two different ways of using the future, two different practices. We're gonna start. Okay, Maciej.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
So, ladies and gentlemen, good evening to all of you. My name is Maciej Agaczek, and it is my great honor and pleasure to welcome you on behalf of all of us at the Polish Society for Future Studies to the centennial debate, the discussion to commemorate the 100th birthday of great Polish science fiction writer, futurologist, and above all, as Professor Bogusław Wolniewicz once said, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, Stanisław Lem. Although none of the members of our society had a chance to meet Lem, it won't be too much of a stretch to say that he was a godfather to our small community. All of us grew up reading his books, and the need to discuss and delve deeper into Lem's thought and philosophy was a cornerstone, a spark to founding the PSFS. Now, after more than a decade from that event, it is our time to pay respects to him in this humble way, the only way that seemed natural for a thinker, the way of an exchange of views and opinions, the way of the debate. So, ladies and gentlemen, tonight discussing the expansion of future consciousness through the practice of science fiction and future studies are our great honorable guests, who I'd like to present to you in this few words of introduction. Professor Thomas Lombardo, the director of the Center for Future Consciousness, editor of Future Consciousness Insights, professor emeritus and retired faculty chair of psychology, philosophy, and the future at Rio Salado College, and past director of the Wisdom Page. He is a fellow and executive board member of the World Future Studies Federation and a member and contributing editor of numerous futurist organizations and publications. He has published 9 books and over 60 articles and given an equal number of professional presentations on many futurist topics, including wisdom and the future of education, the future of consciousness and the human mind, dystopian and utopian thought, theories of the future, and science fiction. It is a pleasure to have you here, Professor. Welcome. I hope we have Professor here with us. And also being here with us tonight is Dr. Karl-Heinz Steinmüller, the scientific director and founding partner of Z. GmbH, the foresight company at Cologne. Since 1991, in the field of future studies, he is engaged in foresight activities for large enterprises and public administrations. Recent public clients include the German Armed Forces, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and the European Environment Agency. His special fields of expertise include technological foresight, scenario generation, and in particular, wildcards. He has also done research into the history and methodology of foresight and lectures about it at Free University Berlin and the German Federal Academy for Security Policy. Thank you, Doctor, for being here tonight with us, and also welcome. And moderating tonight's debate will be my colleague and friend, co-founder of PSFS and a partner at the 4CF Strategic Foresight Company. He served as a strategic foresight consultant for international institutions such as UNESCO or UNDP, as well as for enterprises and non-governmental organizations. Ladies and gentlemen, Kacper Nosarzewski. I hope we can start right now. Kacper, I'm giving the floor back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maciej. This is a very strange ontological situation because I just received confirmation from Professor Lombardo that he is here with us, but we still need to sort out which nick he's using to put spotlight on him, but at least we know that nothing happened to him and that he will be part of our conversation. So, Maciej, I kindly invite you to see if perhaps one of the nicks at some point turns out to be Professor Lombardo. And if I hear from him, I will also let you know. But let's not wait any longer to start the conversation. The purpose of our debate here, celebrating Lem, is inspired by the two personas that Lem cultivated, or to some extent considered to be overlapping. The persona of a futurologist, as the moniker would go in 20th century, when futurology was still considered as the right name and as the right term to talk about future studies, and as a science fiction writer. I will not do an exegesis of different interviews, positions on this in his books by Stanisław Lem, but first and foremost, I think in both these roles, he considers himself to be a man of science. Science, however, is not the only common denominator of science fiction and future studies. We would like to go deeper. We would like to start with psychological and cultural, anthropological background to the practice of science fiction and future studies. We would like to go back to the mythological, to the myth that underlies different practices that we have in relation with the futures. And so our first topic and our first question that I will ask Dr. Steinmüller, I will ask you, Karl-Heinz, is to look into this mythical layer of science fiction and future studies. In myth, often cosmology and the ordering of the world, establishment of values, establishment of order is the core myth, the cosmological myth. It seems, if we believe that science fiction was founded by Mary Shelley in Frankenstein, that science fiction has its roots in romanticism, in a sensual and deeply individualistic, energetic, Dionysiac current of civilization. Future studies, on the other hand, like to trace its roots to the Enlightenment or even to Renaissance thought in the Renaissance Italy, which would mean it's a strand of thought focused on reason, on order, focused, let's say, on the not on the element of Dionysus, but of Apollo, the Apollon. That would mean that the two are in big contradiction. But what is your take on this? In science fiction and future studies, is our cosmos, is our reality a well-ordered whole or a senseless chaos? How do we make sense of it through science fiction and future studies, Karl-Heinz?
Oh, well, that's a difficult question. But first, let me begin with a small anecdote. 40 years ago, Stanislav Lem was celebrating his 60th birthday. And I wrote him a letter in congratulation. And it was so difficult for me to find the right tones, how to address him, and so on. And so I invented a kind of very specific congratulation. I demonstrated that Stanislav Lem did not exist at all. He had written a story about, I think, a radio play about a person who exists or does not exist. And I took it. And my first idea was to say, this man knows too much, as in Western movies, and therefore he is not allowed to exist. And then I invented a story behind Stanislav Lem, and I thought about that he can know only so much by using a time machine. And of course, it's not his own, but he has borrowed the time machine from Professor Tarantoga. And so he is using, or he is stealing this time machine. And when he comes to his home in Osiedle Gliny near Krakow, he puts the time machine in the cellar. But because time is cycling, he gets more and more time machines who are in his cellar. And therefore, I asked him in the letter, oh, please, Mr. Lem, I know you do not exist, but couldn't you simply give me one of your many time machines? And so one has quite different ways to approach such a person. And so one has also different ways to think about the future. One has a perspective which is more sober and scientific and based on enlightenment and based on rational thinking, a perspective in which surely the cosmos has to be at least in a way an ordered entity, so that you can do something about it, that you can shape at least partially the future. And this is the approach of me as a futurist and as a researcher. But as a science fiction writer, I also have a kind of romantic perspective and romantic approach. I'm looking for good stories about the future, and therefore there has to be danger in the story, suspense. There have to be challenges. And the not so very well ordered cosmos is more suited to this kind of approach. It has to be chaotic in a sense. But in fact, when I, as a consultant, give advice to governments or to large companies, I do not think about the cosmos or the ordering of the universe, but I think about the next years. And I think about our opportunities and our chances in the next years. And of course, I have always a part of chaos in it, as we experienced at the beginning of this evening, since I'm a specialist in wild cards, and wild cards always happen. And I'm always looking with my friends, for instance, like Aharon, who is here. I like it very much that he is here. So I'm always looking for wild cards. And then in a certain way, I attract wild cards. Fortunately, this wild card did not happen directly to me, but to my friend Tom Lombardo. That's a pity for him, but I'm sure he will join us in a moment. So we have two different approaches. The approach which needs an ordered cosmos, which obeys certain laws, a lawful cosmos, which can be used then by researchers to develop their strategies and to change something in that cosmos. And on the other hand, we have a romantic, wild cosmos, which perhaps makes sense because it is so senseless, so that we ourselves as human beings have to develop something like sense for this cosmos. But when I look at the astronomers and at persons who are engaged in research about cosmos, I think the reality is more on the side of the chaotic cosmos. We know that there are, well, not evil aliens like we use them in science fiction, but there is a death of stars. Stars die. There are gigantic explosions, supernova explosions. There are black holes, one really big black hole lurking in the center of our galaxy. This is a violent universe which is in constant turmoil. This universe produces intelligence, but it will at some time also destroy intelligence. And therefore, not so much as a futures researcher, but as a person interested in long-term history, I wrote with a colleague from Risk Research recently a paper about the existential threats to mankind. What could annihilate mankind? Of course, we ourselves. We bear the chaos in ourselves, and we may destroy the substance of our own living. That's quite clear. But also, cosmic forces may come in and destroy us. For instance, with a close supernova or some not even really big asteroid hitting Earth, or well, in any way, the only thing that is sure in this universe is death, and also the death of our planet Earth. and we know that our sun will develop into a giant red star within, I think, the next 2 billion years. And at least till that time, we have to find another planet. No, but this is not a topic for me as a futures researcher, but a topic for me as a science fiction writer. And so if you want to have a look at the whole of the cosmos, you need both approaches. You need the sober, rational, scientific approach of a futurist and the more romantic, chaotic, wild, fancy approach of a science fiction writer. And I'm in the happy position to bring both together. And so I feel so well to be here. Thank you again for inviting me, Casper.
Yes, Karl-Heinz, this is a good point. And I'm very glad that we meet here with you today, sharing the roles, wearing both hats, wearing the hat of a science fiction writer and wearing a hat of a futurist and you know, a world-renowned futurist. Because recently, I think this is rather a recent realization and something I see in the future studies over perhaps the last couple of years, that the interest in science fiction as a way of telling stories is increasing. And it comes with a with a certain recognition. It comes with a certain realization. The realization that for any approach to approximate our relationship with the future, that for any attempt to seriously deal with the long-term challenges, but most importantly to the way we think about the future, to the way we are using the future, we cannot limit ourselves to just one way of dealing with this. Of course, things that you've mentioned, like us moving out of our planet, finding another home, is the kind of mythos of the future that will be the tale of the greatest heroes, and that will be the foundation tale perhaps for an entirely new civilization, which meaning and which culture and which values we cannot even try to approximate. Like it's very hard to approximate the values of our ancestors even 40,000 years ago or 60,000 years ago. We learn about this from little pieces of pottery or other archaeological finds, but this is really like trying to learn about the song and the pitch of the song of a bird from its fossil remains in archaeological site in a dig. So this story about the future, even if we were able to tell it accurately, and a ingenious science fiction writer or an ingenious futurist was able to accurately predict what will be our great moving, the great removal of mankind from the Earth and moving to another part of the universe, of our galaxy, most likely, if we want to be realistic about this, which is funny in itself. Even if they got this tale right, I don't think we could even recognize, we could even acknowledge their genius.
Yes.
Why? Of course, because of the bird thing, because even if we saw the future, I'm not saying like Plato that we would be blinded by the truth, but I don't think we would quite believe it. And
yes.
Still, just like mythos are a way of discovering something about ourselves through ancient stories, discovering something about our values, about a human condition, science fiction and future studies are also a way of doing this, only not using the long forgotten, the tales of yore, but the tales of the time to come. So I think this mythology that seems to inspire science fiction and this mythology that seems to be part of science fiction can equally be seen in future studies. And it's being recognized and it's being acknowledged over the last couple of years with something I would call a cultural turn in our discipline, a cultural turn in future studies.
Yeah, well, I observed the same during the last 2 decades, that futures research is at least partly moving out of this rational mode of thinking and acknowledges how important storytelling is. There are already professional storytellers storytellers in our profession. And but it's not only confined to futures research. We have seen in the last decades that narratives have become more and more important in political life and everywhere, and that you need two approaches to narratives. The one approach is to deconstruct narratives. We have a certain method in futures research that is causal layered analysis, where you can deconstruct the common beliefs about the future. And you see then what is the mythological basis of these beliefs. For instance, about growth. What does growth mean in different cultures, and how it is connected with ideas about boundaries or about a certain soil which you need to grow on, etc. Such things. That is one approach, deconstruction. And the second approach is the construction of narratives. And well, about 20 or 15 years ago, I wrote the first scenarios in the likeness of science fiction stories. And it has become more and more frequent. And for instance, in a wonderful project with our Israeli friends and others, which was called Festos, and it was about threats through emerging technologies, we also developed scenarios which were written like science fiction stories. Since the human being is a storytelling and a story listening animal, perhaps it goes back to the times in the caves, the Stone Age or so, that we were telling each other stories in the evening about the hunt and the game we had found, etc. But I think stories bring substance to scenarios. Stories are the way to acquire the future visions of the scenarios. If you write only a report in very sober lines and with bullet points and bullet points and bullet points, perhaps you convince some manager that this is useful. But if you write it like a story, they will be attracted by this future vision and acquire this vision and make it to their own. There are different ways to do this. You need not only write stories, but you can also do it like, say, interviews or presentation of new gadgetry from the future. There are different ways, but the storytelling has become more and more important. And storytelling takes its quality and its power to convince also from a mythological depth. You need a kind of mythos behind the story you tell about the future, story about growth or growth and decay or eternal return of things. So you find all these things again in these future visions. So
yes,
but I see Tom has
Tom
joined
is
us.
here.
I'm so happy.
Great to have you. I'm
Yes,
so glad
I'm
we've
so
recovered you.
Casper and Karl-Heinz and everyone else, there was some kind of mix-up on the time. I apologize. I thought we were beginning in a half an hour. Fortunately, I got on early, but you've been already going for a half an hour?
Yes, this is correct, but we've only covered the first question, and perhaps not entirely, like will be the case for any question that we may ask here. So
I apologize for being late. I wasn't intentionally late. I thought I was coming on early, and somehow the time that I showed was not the time that you had.
Yeah.
So
Tom,
yeah.
glad that you are here with us. I will just say a few more words on the mythology issue, and we will move to the next one to catch up with you. So I completely agree with you, Karl-Heinz. This storytelling and the power of narratives is a blessing for future studies and is a blessing generally for communication in our times. It is, however, a double-edged sword. It's also a curse because some of the stories are so appealing and some of the stories just need to be more in technicolor, not like they are, but somewhat better. And this is, of course, the origin of the whole fake news and alternative truths problem, a problem that, and this origin is something I was sensitized to by our colleague Krzysztof Kornas, who is also present and is listening. Hello, Krzysztof, from the center, from Copernicus Center of Science. This is an issue. We don't need, as futures studies professionals, or in your case, as science fiction authors, we don't need to be worried that much about the truth, because the future does not exist. So any relational Aristotelian definition of truth does not apply to the future. But we still, of course, telling good stories can be put to good work, but it can be also put to bad work, like it is the case, for instance, that our colleague Leah Zaidi, a young Canadian futurist recognized for her work on science fiction and future studies, likes to recall the story of a Russian propaganda master of puppets presently at Kremlin in Putin's administration, presenting, who is both a science fiction writer and a master of social engineering, and he uses the same topics and toposes in his writing as an author and in his doing as a political mastermind. Okay, thanks. And let's move to the next issue that we have on our schedule. We've talked about storytelling, and of course, storytelling needs this little spark of genius, or just something that we all have in common with our capacity of abstract thinking as human beings, the creativity. It's obvious that creativity is necessary for writing a science fiction story or a science fiction novel, because this is what we associate with inspiration and what we associate with creative arts, and literature is one of them. But it's not so obvious what role creativity plays, this moment of imagination and invention, in future studies, especially given that as future studies professionals, we are expected to be serious, we are expected to be realistic, work on plausible futures. Isn't there, perhaps this is here where we can find a clear line of distinction, a clear contradiction between science fiction and future studies in creativity? What would you say about this, Tom, if I may ask you?
Yes, my response on this one, and I wish I had heard what you had to say on myth. Maybe I'll be able to get a few points in on that as we go along. My response would be that all humans to different degrees are creative, and they're all creative because we indeed are participants in a creative universe. And that whether we're practicing future studies or practicing economics or physics or whatever, creativity comes into play in all those different spheres. And in future studies in particular, if we highlight that out, one can be credible and plausible and make sense about one's different probable or preferable futures and be creative at the same time. And in fact, we would judge the quality in terms of its intellectual stimulation from a future studies practitioner in terms of how creative they indeed are, as well as some other variables too. Now, what do I mean by that exactly? What I mean is that when one is creative, one builds upon a corpus of knowledge and ideas that one has learned, that one ingests from the world around them, but one combines them together, those elements, in novel ways, and produces new gestalts, new relationships out of all of that. And indeed, in future studies for a long time, there has been an ongoing critique that lots of futurists stay stuck in certain mindsets, certain worldviews, and it's important to try to break out of that, to bring in other worldviews and to work with them as well. So I don't think there's any hard and fast line between the importance of creativity in future studies and the importance of creativity in science fiction. It's the methodology that may be different. But in both cases, and I would always put this expression up when I would teach courses on future consciousness, the future is the act of creation, not something a long, long time ago, but the future right now is the act of creation, and we're all participating in it. So the future is inherently creative. We are inherently creative, and we're all participating in this ongoing creation of reality. How intelligent we do it, how imaginatively we do it is another whole thing. But it's not like future studies is because it's supposed to be credible, plausible, cannot be creative. In fact, I've always found that the more knowledgeable a person is as to the complexities of reality, the more creative they become, the more imaginative they become. So that's the first response to that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, this is true, that this creativity, as it permeates any human activity, well, except for some, but let's say many human activities, is not also taken out of the equation in future studies. And I don't think even for the most for the icons of our trade, people like let's say Helmer, Kahn, Toffler, or for Ed Cornish from Welch's Future Society, or other people who's been out there. You can tell many things about them, but you can't tell that they were not creative, even though they were not in creative arts. But this creativity in imagining and in bringing about different visions, and in animating also, so to speak, being standing behind different movements and initiatives that creatively challenge status quo or present assumptions about the future, seem also to be speaking in favor of the argument that creativity is also undeniable part of future studies. But Karl-Heinz, you are probably in the best position to compare the two, to compare the emotional relation also that you have as a science fiction author with your work, with your oeuvre, and the kind of emotional relationship in creativity that you get when you're wearing your future studies professional hat.
Well, creativity is needed in both. And sometimes I ask myself, where do these new ideas, these sparks of the future come from? And I observed that I very often are in a dreaming or dreamlike state when I develop new ideas, as well as a science fiction writer and as a futurist. And sometimes in some, say, rather dull parts of a future study, I ask myself, how can I bring in more weird ideas, more wild ideas, more fancy ideas, which resemble more the future, since the future will be something very weird to us. So, but I know that there are these are different arenas of play, different arenas for future studies and for science fiction, and perhaps even with different definitions of plausibility. So when the results of a future study should be plausible, they have to be logically coherent. They have to be not in conflict with existing present facts. And usually you have to convince skeptical clients about them. And if you mix in too much creativity, too much weird ideas, and perhaps they will get even more skeptical, and that's not good for the project. But on the other hand, when I write science fiction, I can rely on what is called the willing suspense of disbelief, as always in the arts. Willing suspense of disbelief by reliance on scientific and technological progress. At least that's mostly the case in science fiction. So there is another kind of skepticism which applies to science fiction. It is skepticism to the behavior of the actors. Usually in a future study, you have no real actors. Of course, you have actors that the government, that's company XYZ, etc. In a science fiction story, you have human beings as protagonists, as heroes, and they have to behave in a plausible way. And this is a more everyday plausibility than the plausibility for a foresight study. So these are different things, but with a common denominator.
Yes. In my experience, it's funny in almost every project that no matter how hard we work on managing the expectations and actually understanding the needs and expectations of the client, there is sooner or later a moment of realization or a moment of a discovery on the client side that either we are not the kind of eggheads, from the laboratory they expected, who would model with statistics the future, the possible futures, or to the other extreme, that we are not some kind of, dreamy, pot-smoking visionaries who will come and tell them about, really science fiction futures. And it never ceases to amaze me, because I don't know which one of these archetypes I fall into more. I don't see myself in either of them, but it never ceases to amaze me that people have, on the client side, have a strong preconception of an archetype of what you should be doing in your social role of being a quote unquote futurologist, or your social role of being, a creative, and it's either to one extreme of a deeply analytical person, or a deeply creative and perhaps synthesizing personality. And when they discover that we actually walk on two legs like every other human being, and we can combine these two elements, this is a funny realization. But this is also a moment when the trust has been established, and we can go wilder in one or other direction. So either we can present, like what we do with our clients, we can present more and more sophisticated lenses through which analytically we can look at data that was, and to the knowledge that was created in the project, or we can go in the other extreme and say, okay, let's do some wildcards, let's do some futuring, and let's get a little wild, let's get a little crazy with the knowledge that was presented. So actually, these preconceptions are, as long as we are aware of them, are not a big issue.
Yeah, but the worst thing which can happen to you from the side of your client is that they expect that you know the future. Yes. And this happens sometimes. I know a case when we developed 4 or 5 wonderful scenarios, and after the exercise, the CEO came to me and said, honestly, Mr. Steinmüller, your gut feeling, what scenario will it be? So, and I realized that from a pedagogical side, I did not do my job.
Thomas, do you believe, as a psychologist, that this is just, people feeling insecure and willing, wanting for certainty, wanting for some kind of stable point in an unstable, fluid reality? Or is it something deeper, this distrust of creativity and hoping that we can actually predict the future accurately?
Well, to begin with, speaking as a psychologist, humans have, as a very deep, pervasive motivation in them, stability, which connects up with psychological security. And so ambiguity and uncertainty, people to various degrees find aversive. And so if I say the future is uncertain and no one can tell you for sure what's going to happen, that generates in people various levels of anxiety. Now, it varies among individuals, but still there is a very powerful need and people across the board, maybe the most fundamental need across the board psychologically, for stability, for coherence, for meaning. And when you make things sound fuzzy wuzzy and uncertain in the future, comes off that way in the sense that, we can't be certain about it, that people recoil. Now, people, of course, make various efforts to try to reduce the uncertainty. And futurists, indeed, are in the business of trying to reduce the uncertainty. But science fiction writers are as well, too, by at least trying to present different possibilities, at least get your head around something. Yeah. But I think it's also true that insofar as the future will inherently be in a lot of ways different than the present, any good idea about the future is going to create anxiety and dissonance in people. Anything that is different and fundamentally different. I noticed somebody up here put up something about we become less creative in terms of our visioning of the future, but we become less creative perhaps because we've been influenced by a certain set of dominant mindsets as opposed to it being more open. So when people predict the future, they're looking for some degree of psychological security. This goes all the way back to Plato, the search for certainty. We want certainty. And when we can't find it, it bothers us. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. I completely agree with everything you said, except for one thing. I think the way you're presenting future studies here about reducing uncertainty can be debated, because I see it more and more in our own work at 4CF, in my team, but also with our colleagues. And I see it strongly emphasized in the futures literacy movement that is animated mostly by Real Miller from UNESCO, head of foresight at UNESCO, where really embracing uncertainty and learning to live with uncertainty. So trying to somehow influence this psychological relationship of a client with towards the future, so that they are less apprehensive, so that they are more on board with this uncertainties, seems to be right. It's of course not the only way of looking at this. And if you recollect, for instance, James Dewar's book on that I think the subtitle was, and the book is somewhere around here, I think, avoiding avoidable surprises, reducing avoidable surprises. I also say that this is a legitimate way of putting this, because in a way, what we want people to, the people we work for to understand is that they need to take into account some phenomena that are more or less likely to realize, and not deny them completely. Not to live in denial that something may change, like you said, but also acknowledge that we cannot accurately predict the future. So they need to start, to learn to live with this. So they need to learn to live with the fact that the movement in the tall grass may be a tiger or may not be a tiger, and we have no fantastic X-ray as futurists to tell them, is it the tiger or is it not?
I would agree, Kasper, that a message that's presented by lots of people over the last decades has been that there is an inherent amount of uncertainty in life. Maybe that message probably goes back decades and decades. And there's uncertainty with respect to the future. One should face it as opposed to think or believe that one can prophesize and one can say with absolute certainty that this is what the future is going to hold. But even the people who will say there is uncertainty and one has to acknowledge it will create various different scenarios and plausible or possible images to give us some sense, some range of intelligible alternatives to reduce, again, the uncertainty.
Yeah.
So if I said that everything is completely uncertain, then in a sense, what I'm arguing is that in the next nanosecond, any possible thing may happen. And that's ridiculous, okay, fundamentally.
There is practical.
There is a certain amount of predictability, lawfulness. To say that it's entirely uncertain is an extremist position, and people even when they acknowledge the uncertainty, will lay out different scenarios in front of their readers, their clients, whatever. They don't go all the way into absolute chaos. Clark Ashton Smith, in a science fiction writer in the 1930s, in a science fiction story called The Dimension of Chance, envisions a alternate reality in which the laws of reality fluctuate, and even down to geometrical principles fluctuate, but not entirely. But it's still very disconcerting to the individuals because things just continually transform in shape. You know, it's approaching the point where it just becomes almost nonsensical. He doesn't quite go that far with it. Okay, so yeah, you can say, yes, there's uncertainty, agreed, yes, but only up to a point, and then they will, of course, throw in different ideas, possibilities.
I want to wrap up this creativity chapter of our conversation, but there is one more thing that comes to my mind that I wanted to confront this with you, and this is precisely about the new and the old, and the possibility of new things happening. I see this debate a bit in our field about the notion of emergence, and emergence being the answer to understanding emergence through systems analysis, but also through philosophical and engineering approaches to emergence. Emergence as being something a bit of a how to put it, a bit of a cure-all, of a silver bullet to answering the question of uncertainty. You know, that new things happen, emergence is part of reality, and I couldn't agree more. This is a fact, both in technological developments as it is in biology, for instance, in evolution. But on the other hand, it should be also stressed that emergence, because of law of conservation of mass and law of conservation of energy, and of course because of the this funny equivalence between transitions between mass and energy, it's only on a certain level, that it's always an emergence from a system of existing elements. So it's not emergence like kind of deus ex machina, something materializing from nowhere and solving the problem. The way to solve problems that organizations or mankind has, or solving the problems of individual, can of course be done through novel ways, through invention, through creating new solutions. And this is often why people look for inspiration in science fiction, I guess, or they turn to future studies professionals and bring their money to the shop, because they want to find solutions to things that torment them, to issues that they are dealing with. Still, it cannot be forgotten that these solutions will only be built on the building blocks that we have today, just by rearranging them differently. But maybe this is a little extreme. Karl-Heinz, what do you think?
Well, I think emergence does not simply mean the rearrangement of existing things. It means new approaches. It means that your old concepts do no longer apply, and therefore these are not the old building blocks. The new things are not built from existing building blocks. They are built from a new perception of that what exists. And we always look at the world with our own concepts, with our preconceptions, and try to arrange the things around us into our worldview. But the emergent things do not obey the structure we give to the world, and therefore they emerge. That means that emergence does not mean they emerge somewhere out in reality, but they emerge in our worldview, in our perspective. And one example for this is the search for weak signals. As futurists, we very often try to have a sharp lookout for weak signals, for small signs which indicate the approach of something important, which are portents in a philosophical sense. But you can, how to define weak signal, and I think a Dutch researcher has given a kind of definition to what weak means. Weak means something that does not fit into our preconceived concepts, and therefore we don't see it. This is in a blind spot. The new things come from within our blind spot. That's all I wanted to say.
Can I make
But another idea about creativity, we should also think about linguistic creativity.
Yeah.
Many foresight people invent new words, at least the French researchers. They are very good in inventing new terms. But Stanislav Lem was wonderful in coining new terms, like imitology, cerebromatics, peripheral and central phantomatics, and such things. So,
Yes.
and
Okay.
one needs
Can I
also
make-
linguistic creativity.
I want to make a comment on Karl-Heinz and Casper on your comments. Let's distinguish between two kinds of emergence. There's the concept of emergence as scientists, in particular physical scientists, have used it in describing new emerging gestalts that come out of the combination of more simpler elements in the universe. That emergence goes on in the physical universe as we build up from the elementary to the more complex. And the new levels that emerge, they are not in any sense just a combination of the more elementary elements. They are something that is a relational reality that literally pops into existence that was not there before. Okay. Now, Karl-Heinz brings up psychological emergence, arguing that indeed we get new ideas, but I would respond to that. Yes, we do get new ideas, but I would bet you that every new idea we have ever created has been inspired and has been a consequence of people taking ideas from before and playing around with them and putting them together, and whammo, we get something new that comes up. So I don't think there is anything like absolute creativity in the sense of a complete something from nothing, but there's, in both cases, physical and psychological, a clear case of emergence where something new is there that wasn't there before, but it involved putting together and connecting together. Like Arthur Koestler does a good job of this in the book, The Act of Creation, talking about creativity, how it involves both the old and something new. I would respond back that way on the issue of creativity, on both kinds of creativity and emergence in both cases.
Yeah, I agree fully, Tom, that every new idea has an ancestry of elder ideas. But you can see the ancestry only in retrospect. You cannot do it forward looking. That's the problem.
Oh, yes. But that in fact points out that there are new things under the sun, that I can't entirely anticipate what is to come, in part because there is emergence. Yeah. So something new happens. That even though it reflected the before, it goes beyond the before.
Yeah. Yes. Even futurists are surprised sometimes.
Right.
Surprised? Yes. Okay.
Okay. Dear colleagues, I suggest we move on to the next chapter of our discussion, and I think this different anticipations and different reactions to emergence can bring us clearly to the next thing that we had scheduled for our conversation. So the question of values and the question of perceptions of optimism, pessimism, certain fatalism. There is a lot, and there has always been a lot of irony in Stanisław Lem's work and his ironic and grotesque sometimes concepts on which he built his novels and on which he built the concepts on which he built his short stories are tell us something about his insight into reality and his, let's say, not very enthusiastic approach to humans as opposed to science, which doesn't mean that he was any kind of misanthropist. No, absolutely not.
Yeah. He used the human body as a physician, so no question.
Yes, and the son of a physician too. So let's now try to tackle this. The values in our conversations about the future. In science fiction, they seem to guide the genres, dystopias, kind of post-apocalyptic. We know that post-apo will always be, pessimistic about the future because the assumption is pessimistic, that there has been an apocalypse. In some kinds of space opera, the faster than light settings, let's say, we feel a bit of optimism, like in Star Trek, yes, where we see that it's all been okay. What's your take on this? How to what extent these values influence the ways we imagine the future across the two genres?
You want me? I can go.
Yes, please do.
Okay, all right. Speaking as a psychologist, but also as a philosopher on this one, I don't think there's any way around the fact that our values have an impact on our understanding of reality, how we see it, and on the, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Something went wrong with the webcam utility here on my end. I can't see Casper. Oh, there's the ceiling now. Casper, now you're back. Okay, good. All right. Okay. And to believe that one can be in a cognitive state that is not in any way influenced by values that I have, to be in a non-judgmental factual ascertainment is a totally naive position psychologically. So anybody who tells you here are the facts or here are the possible facts, even a scientist, is naive with respect to the nature of their own mind that has concocted and created their interpretations and visions of reality. Values are always going to be there, okay? When it comes to our understanding of the future, what we see as dystopias or what we see as utopias, that is, to what degree we're optimistic or pessimistic, that depends upon our values that we possess. I take as an example two classic dystopias, We and Brave New World, which are usually interpreted as dystopias. But if one stops and reflects on them and looks at them closely, one could see how indeed you could make a case that they are presenting utopian visions, but that are so dissonant with our own values that we see them as dystopian because our values are so at odds. Our value of individuality, in particular, individual determination in there. One of the things, though, that I would just throw in right off the bat with respect to optimism and pessimism is that optimism and pessimism psychologically have self-fulfilling prophecy effects. So people talk about the fact